The salt-tinged wind rattled the windows of Tidewater Cafe as Lyra Moss stacked the last of the chairs onto tables. Her movements were practiced, efficient, the same routine she had performed every evening for the past 18 months since taking over this weathered cafe on Wellbrooks Marina. The clock above the espresso machine showed 9:30 on New Year's Eve, and through the frosted windows, she could see couples hurrying toward the town square where fireworks would light up the harbor at midnight. Everyone had somewhere to be tonight. Everyone except her. Lyra adjusted the navy apron tied around her waist and surveyed the small space that had become her entire world. The cafe was humble with its scuffed wooden floors and mismatched vintage furniture, but it belonged to her. The pastry case that usually displayed her homemade desserts now held only 2 unsold lemon tarts and a handful of macarons. Business had been challenging since the resort opened down the coast, drawing tourists away from Wellbrooks' modest marina. She was reaching to turn off the espresso machine when she heard it, a sharp, urgent pounding on the glass door. Lyra froze. Every instinct told her to ignore it, to slip upstairs to her tiny apartment and spend the evening as she had planned, alone with a book and chamomile tea. But something in the desperate rhythm of that knocking made her move toward the door instead. The man outside looked like he had stepped out of a different world entirely. His charcoal suit was rumpled, his white shirt partially untucked, and even through the condensation on the glass, she could see the exhaustion carved into his features. Dark hair fell across his forehead, damp from the mist rolling in from the ocean. He knocked again, and she could see his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Lyra unlocked the door and pulled it open. The smell of brine and winter rushed in along with the man, who nearly stumbled across the threshold. His dress shoes slipped slightly on the entrance mat, and she instinctively reached out to steady him. Up close, she could see he was perhaps in his mid-30s, with deep brown eyes that held an emotion she recognized too intimately. Isolation. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with cold. "I know you're closed. I saw your lights and I needed somewhere warm for a moment." Lyra locked the door behind him and gestured to the nearest chair. "Sit down before you collapse. Let me get you something hot." She didn't wait for his response. In the small kitchen behind the counter, she prepared Earl Grey tea and plated one of the lemon tarts with a dollop of fresh cream. When she returned, the man had shed his suit jacket and was rubbing his hands together, trying to restore circulation. She set the tea and dessert in front of him and lowered herself into the opposite chair. "I'm Lyra," she offered simply. He looked up, something like surprise flickering across his face at the kindness in her tone. Cale Theron. Thank you for this. I can pay, of course." "It's New Year's Eve," Lyra interrupted with a small wave of her hand. "Consider it a gift to start your year." She studied him quietly, noting the expensive watch on his wrist, the quality of his clothing despite its dishevelment. "You're not from Wellbrook." "San Francisco," he replied, wrapping both hands around the ceramic mug. "I was flying to a business retreat in Portland. The helicopter had mechanical issues. We had to make an emergency landing at a private airstrip about 3 miles from here. My pilot is arranging repairs, but everything is closed for the holiday. My phone died somewhere between the airstrip and your door." Lyra glanced toward the windows where fog was thickening along the waterfront, obscuring the distant lights of boats in the harbor. "You walked 3 miles in this weather?" "I didn't have many options," Cale said with a tired smile. He took a sip of tea and seemed to come back to life. "This is excellent. Really excellent." He noticed the empty pastry case, the quiet stillness of the cafe, the single coat hanging by the door. "You were here alone?" "Always," Lyra said before she could stop herself. She caught the slip and amended, I own the place. Just me. No staff to worry about on holidays." Something in the way she said it made Cale look at her more carefully. She was lovely in a natural, unpretentious way, auburn hair pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder, green eyes that held both warmth and wariness, a dusting of freckles across her nose and cheeks. She wore a cream sweater beneath her apron and faded jeans, flowers smudged on her right elbow that she hadn't noticed. "What about you?" Lyra asked, redirecting attention away from herself. "No family waiting for you to ring in the new year?" Cale's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have family. A sister in Chicago, a mother in Arizona. But we don't really do holidays together anymore. Not since my father and younger brother died in a sailing accident 6 years ago. After that, everyone just scattered. Tonight was supposed to be about networking, not family." Lyra nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. "My parents retired to Portugal last year. They wanted me to visit, but I couldn't leave the cafe. My aunt, she left me this place when she passed. I promised her I'd make it something special." "Promises to the dead are the heaviest ones to carry," Cale said quietly. Lyra felt something shift in her chest. This stranger understood. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration drifting from the town square. Cale finished his tart and smiled genuinely for the first time. "This is incredible. You made this yourself?" "Everything here is homemade," Lyra confirmed. "It's the only way I know how to do things." Cale set down his fork and met her eyes. "Thank you, Lyra. For opening your door to a stranger on New Year's Eve. For this food, this warmth. You didn't have to do any of it." "Maybe I needed the company as much as you needed the shelter," Lyra admitted softly. The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Outside, the fog continued to roll in thick and heavy, wrapping Wellbrook in a cocoon of white. Inside the small cafe, two lonely people had found an unexpected connection. "The weather's getting worse," Lyra observed, glancing at the windows. "You shouldn't try to walk back in this. My apartment is just upstairs. It's small, but I have a couch. You're welcome to stay until morning when your pilot can arrange transportation." Cale hesitated, not wanting to impose but also not wanting this moment to end. "Are you sure?" Lyra stood and began gathering their empty dishes. "I'm sure. Besides, I'd never forgive myself if I sent you back out into that fog and something happened." As she led him toward the narrow staircase at the back of the cafe, Cale felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple comfort of human kindness without expectation or agenda. He didn't know it yet, but climbing those stairs would change the entire trajectory of his carefully constructed life. Behind them, through the cafe windows, the first fireworks began to paint the foggy sky with bursts of gold and silver, marking the arrival of a new year and the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. Lyra's apartment was modest but inviting. The living space flowed seamlessly into a galley kitchen, with exposed wooden beams crossing the ceiling and large windows overlooking the marina. A small evergreen tree stood in the corner, decorated with simple glass ornaments and white lights. Cale noticed there were no gifts beneath it. "Make yourself comfortable," Lyra said, gesturing toward the overstuffed sofa draped with a knitted throw. "I'll make us something warm to drink." Cale settled onto the couch but found himself drawn to the bookshelf against the wall, examining the collection of culinary books and classic novels. Photographs were tucked between the volumes, a young Lyra with an older woman, both covered in flour and laughing at something beyond the frame. "That was taken a month before she died," Lyra called from the kitchen. "She had just taught me her secret recipe for chocolate soufflé. We were so busy laughing we forgot about the first batch and they collapsed completely." Cale smiled at the captured joy. "She looks like she was wonderful." "She was everything," Lyra replied softly. "She raised me summers when my parents were traveling for work. This cafe was her dream, and somehow she made it mine too." The sound of the kettle whistling filled the comfortable quiet. Cale returned to the kitchen doorway and watched as Lyra moved with practiced grace, pulling cocoa powder from a cupboard, measuring ingredients with confidence. "You said you could follow instructions," she said without turning. "Can you reach the mugs from that top shelf?" "I think I can manage that," Cale said with a slight smile. They worked side by side in the narrow kitchen, and Cale found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. There was something grounding about this simple task, making hot chocolate with a woman who was beginning to feel less like a stranger with every passing minute. "So what kind of business are you in?" Lyra asked as she stirred the cocoa mixture on the stove, the rich aroma filling the apartment. "Renewable energy technology," Cale replied. "I started a company 9 years ago developing solar integration systems for residential use. It grew faster than I imagined. Now we have installations in 14 states and expanding internationally." "That sounds impressive," Lyra said, though her tone suggested she was more interested in the person than the accomplishments. "It looks impressive on paper," Cale admitted. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot why I started it. I wanted to make a real difference in sustainability. Instead, I just made a lot of money. Those aren't always the same thing." Lyra nodded thoughtfully as she poured the hot chocolate into mugs. "My aunt used to say that success without purpose is just noise. It gets loud, but it doesn't mean anything." "Your aunt was wise," Cale said, accepting his mug. "When did you know you wanted to take over the cafe?" Lyra was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know. Not at first. When she got sick, I came back to Wellbrook to help her. I had been working as a pastry chef in Seattle, upscale restaurants, competition baking, the whole thing. It was exciting but empty. Then I spent those last 6 months with her, baking in this little cafe, learning the names of regular customers, and I realized I'd been chasing the wrong version of success." "What was the right version?" Cale asked. "This," Lyra said simply. "Connection. Community. Making something with my hands that brings people genuine joy. It's not glamorous and it certainly doesn't pay well, but it's real." They carried their mugs to the living room and settled on opposite ends of the sofa, the knitted throw stretched across both of them. Through the windows, they could hear distant music and laughter from the harbor celebrations. "Tell me about your father and brother," Lyra said gently. "You said they died in a sailing accident." Cale stared into his hot chocolate, his jaw tightening with old grief. "My brother Marcus was only 19. He was home from college for the summer. My father loved sailing, it was the one thing that made him slow down from work. They went out on a perfect morning, and a freak storm came up faster than anyone predicted. By the time the Coast Guard found them, it was too late." "I'm so sorry," Lyra said, her voice thick with empathy. "My father had always been driven, always working, but he and Marcus were close. They understood each other in a way I never quite managed. After they died, it was like the center of our family just disappeared. Mom couldn't stay in the house. My sister moved across the country. And I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that made sense." Lyra shifted closer, closing some of the distance between them. "Is that why you work so hard? Because it's easier than feeling the loss?" Cale looked at her, startled by her insight. "Maybe. I never thought about it that way. I told myself I was honoring them by succeeding, by making something meaningful. But here I am, 36 years old, spending New Year's Eve in a stranger's apartment because I was flying to a business retreat instead of being with the people I have left." Lyra reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. The gesture was simple but profound. Sometimes strangers are the safest people to be honest with. No history, no expectations. Just two people being real. Cale looked at her hand on his, small, warm, slightly calloused from years of working with dough and hot pans. He turned his hand over and held hers gently. "Thank you for listening. I don't usually talk about this." "Neither do I," Lyra admitted. They talked for hours, sharing stories that peeled back layers of carefully constructed defenses. Lyra told him about her broken engagement 3 years ago, how her fiancé had left her for someone more ambitious, someone who wanted the same fast-paced city life he craved. Cale told her about the loneliness of success, how the bigger his company grew, the more isolated he felt. At some point, their bodies shifted closer together on the couch. The conversation flowed into comfortable silences, and those silences felt as meaningful as the words. "Can I ask you something?" Cale said softly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Yes," Lyra whispered. "Why does this feel like I've known you forever?" Lyra's breath caught. "I've been wondering the same thing." The space between them seemed to evaporate. Cale lifted his free hand and tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Lyra's eyes fluttered closed at the tender touch. "Lyra," he murmured. "I don't want to rush you or assume anything. But I need you to know, this isn't just a moment for me. You're not just a kind stranger. You're something more." She opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing vulnerability and desire and something deeper, genuine care. "I feel it too. And it terrifies me." "We don't have to be terrified alone," Cale said. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, Lyra closed the remaining distance, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was tender and searching. It deepened gradually, naturally, as they discovered each other through touch and taste. Cale's hands moved to frame her face, holding her as if she were precious and fragile. Lyra's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. The kiss spoke of loneliness finally finding solace, of two people who had been holding themselves apart from the world suddenly allowing themselves to feel. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Lyra rested her forehead against his. "I haven't felt this way in so long. Like I matter to someone." "You matter," Cale assured her. "You matter so much already." She pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. "Cale, I need you to know something about me. I don't do casual. I've tried, and it nearly broke me. If we're doing this, whatever this is, I need honesty and patience." "I can give you both," Cale promised. "I want to give you both." Lyra took a shaky breath, then stood and extended her hand to him. "Come with me." Cale took her hand and let her lead him to her bedroom. The space was small and cozy, with a wrought iron bed covered in white linens and more photographs on the dresser. Lyra turned to face him, nervous but certain. "I want this," she said clearly. "I want you. But slowly. With meaning." "However you want," Cale said, drawing her close again. "We have all night." They undressed each other slowly, reverently, discovering bodies and vulnerabilities in equal measure. Cale was patient and attentive, learning what made Lyra gasp and sigh, what touches made her relax and which made her arch toward him. She explored him with equal care, finding the places where tension lived in his shoulders, the sensitive spots along his ribs, the way his breathing changed when she kissed his throat. When they finally came together, it was with a tenderness that neither had experienced before. Cale held her gaze, watching her face as pleasure built and broke over them both. Lyra felt seen and cherished in a way that made tears slip from the corners of her eyes. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Lyra's head on Cale's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow and steady. "Stay," she whispered into the darkness. "Not just tonight. Stay tomorrow. Stay until you have to leave." Cale pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I'll stay as long as you'll have me." They fell asleep wrapped in each other, the sound of midnight fireworks finally fading over the harbor, marking not just a new year but a new beginning for two people who had found unexpected grace in each other's arms. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through sheer curtains. Lyra woke slowly, aware of warmth beside her before she fully remembered the night before. When consciousness returned, she turned to find Cale already awake, watching her with soft eyes. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Lyra replied, suddenly shy despite the intimacy they had shared. Cale reached out and traced the line of her jaw. "No regrets?" "No regrets," Lyra confirmed. "You?" "Only that I have to eventually leave," Cale admitted. They stayed in bed longer than necessary, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Eventually, hunger drove them to the kitchen where they made breakfast together, scrambled eggs and toast, coffee that Lyra brewed strong and black. "I should check on my pilot," Cale said reluctantly as they sat at her small kitchen table. "Figure out when the helicopter will be ready." "Of course," Lyra said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "You have a life to get back to." Cale set down his coffee cup and took her hand. "Lyra, what if I don't want to rush back? What if I want to see where this goes? You live in San Francisco. You have a company to run." This was the most real thing I've felt in 6 years, Cale interrupted. "Yes, I live in San Francisco. Yes, I have responsibilities. But I also have autonomy and resources. I can work remotely. I can restructure. I can make this a priority if you're willing to let me try." Lyra searched his face for any sign of empty promises. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to come back. This weekend, next weekend, as often as I can. I want to get to know you, really know you. Your favorite breakfast, what makes you laugh, what you dream about when you let yourself dream. I want to see if this connection is as real as it feels right now." Tears pricked Lyra's eyes. "I'm scared. I don't trust easily anymore." "Then I'll earn your trust," Cale said simply. "One visit at a time. One kept promise at a time. No pressure, no demands. Just possibility." Lyra nodded, not trusting her voice. Cale leaned across the table and kissed her softly, sealing the promise. He left that afternoon, but not before taking her number, kissing her thoroughly one more time, and promising to call that evening. Lyra watched his hired car disappear down the coastal road, hope and fear warring in her chest. True to his word, Cale called that night. And the next. And the next. He returned the following weekend, staying at a small bed and breakfast in town. They spent the days together, walking along the beach, cooking in her apartment, talking until late into the night. He met her regular customers at the cafe, learning names and orders, fitting himself into the rhythm of her life. The pattern continued. Cale came every weekend, the N extended his stays. He rented a furnished cottage overlooking the harbor and set up a home office. He attended town council meetings with Lyra when she presented ideas for revitalizing the Marina district. He helped her repair the cafe's temperamental espresso machine and painted the exterior trim a fresh coastal blue. 3 months into their relationship, over dinner at her apartment, Cale made a proposal. "Let me invest in Tidewater Cafe. Not as charity, but as a genuine business investment. You have something special, Lyra. With some capital for equipment upgrades and marketing, this place could become a destination." Lyra was hesitant. "I don't want your money to change things between us." "It won't," Cale assured her. "We'll make it official, contracts, terms, everything professional. You'll maintain complete creative control. I just want to help you build what you've been dreaming about." After careful consideration and consultation with a lawyer, Lyra agreed. The investment transformed the cafe. New equipment made operations smoother. A redesigned space created more seating. Word spread about the exceptional pastries and welcoming atmosphere. Lyra hired 2 part-time staff members, finally giving herself breathing room. But the real transformation was in Lyra and Cale themselves. They learned each other deeply. Cale discovered that Lyra sang old folk songs while baking and that she cried during sappy commercials. Lyra learned that Cale had nightmares about the sailing accident and that he made terrible jokes when he was nervous. They had their first real fight 5 months in, about Cale's tendency to solve problems with money rather than presence. Instead of retreating to old patterns, they worked through it, learning to communicate needs and boundaries. Each obstacle they overcame strengthened rather than weakened their foundation. Cale gradually mended relationships with his family, encouraged by Lyra's gentle insistence that love required effort. His mother visited Wellbrook and fell in love with both Lyra and the coastal town. His sister started calling regularly again. The family that had scattered in grief slowly began to reconnect. 1 year to the day after their first meeting, Cale asked Lyra to close the cafe early. When she arrived, the space had been transformed with hundreds of white candles and pale pink roses. A path of flower petals led from the door to the center of the room where Cale stood waiting, wearing the same suit he had worn the night they met. "Lyra," he said as she approached, tears already streaming down her face. "A year ago, I stumbled through your door looking for shelter from a storm. What I found was home. You saw past my success to the lonely man underneath. You taught me that meaning comes from connection, not achievement. You gave me a reason to slow down and a place to belong." He knelt, pulling out a simple platinum band with a single perfect diamond. "I promised you patience. I promised you honesty. I've kept those promises, and I'll keep them for the rest of my life if you'll let me. Will you marry me?" Lyra was laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes. Yes, absolutely yes." Cale stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her as applause erupted from outside. Through the windows, she could see their friends and neighbors gathered, celebrating with them. They married 3 months later in a ceremony on the beach at sunset, the cafe's outdoor space transformed with market lights and wildflowers. His mother and sister stood on his side. Her parents flew in from Portugal. The town of Wellbrook turned out in full force. It was intimate and perfect and exactly what they both wanted. As Lyra stood beside Cale, exchanging vows with the ocean as their witness, she thought about that foggy New Year's Eve. About the courage it took to open the door. About the choice to trust despite fear. Cale promised to always show up, to treasure her courage, to build a life of meaning together. Lyra promised to always see him truly, to challenge him toward presence, to create joy in everyday moments. Years later, when people asked how they met, Lyra would smile and say, "A storm brought us together." But it was the choice to stay, the daily decision to keep choosing each other through ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges, that built their forever. Cale restructured his company, promoting key employees and shifting to remote leadership. He never returned to 80-hour weeks. He had found something more valuable than professional success, he had found purpose. Lyra never spent another holiday alone. She had found something she thought was lost forever, the courage to love without holding back. Their story became woven into Wellbrook's fabric, the entrepreneur and the baker, the New Year's miracle. But to them, it was simply their life. Imperfect, real, and more beautiful than either had imagined possible. And every New Year's Eve, they returned to that same couch where they first truly saw each other, holding hands and remembering the night that changed everything. Because that's what love really is, not the magical beginning, but the patient dailiness of choosing each other, celebrating growth, weathering hardship together, and building something that lasts.